Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Cherwell acquired by Ivanti technical deep dive. And this one today is going to be about adaptive forms and how to improve your user experience and streamline the design process. My name is Tabitha Ishman, and I'm the marketing manager of Excalibur Data Systems. And I just wanted to take another second to welcome all of you to the webinar today, and then just talk about a few logistics before we get started. So the lines are muted and the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be sent via email to all participants tomorrow, and we'll answer questions at the end in a Q&A session, but you can feel free to ask questions anytime during the presentation just by typing them into the question window. A little bit about Excalibur Data Systems is we are a leading edge consulting firm guiding organizations through their digital transformation journey. We work with strategic partners and leverage best of breed enterprise service management technologies. So in doing so, we help create next generation solutions for our customers. And just so we can dive into a lot of the great content for you guys today, to kick us off, I'd like to introduce Sean Doherty, Solution Architect and Consultant at Excalibur Data Systems. So welcome, Sean.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Just quickly about myself, I have got about 18 plus years in the IT industry. I've done a variety of roles from service desk, networking, SharePoint administration, and now ITSM. Currently, I have about 3+ years of Cherwell ITSM administration and delivery experience. I've been involved on projects where we've delivered to medium-sized businesses to larger enterprises with the Cherwell solution. And a few of the things that drove me to become an ITSM and a Cherwell consultant was just due to the fact that with Cherwell is much like a Swiss Army knife. You know, the bigger the knife, the more tools you have. And you know, Cherwell allows you to create very innovative solutions to elevate the customer experience and user engagement on the Cherwell platform. Actually, in some ways, I think a Swiss Army knife analogy is wrong. It's more like giving a little kid a big bucket of Lego and saying, here, go play, create something. So on that note, let's move into our presentation this afternoon. So what we're going to do is the overview of today's adaptive form is we're going to talk a little bit about adaptive forms versus some responsive forms. We're going to talk also about tailoring the adaptive forms, showcase how to create a form in Cherwell, and we're going to give you some advice for Cherwell administrators on dealing with adaptive forms. Because as a consultant, you know, we've seen a variety of instances where we've either gone into an organization that has Cherwell and assisted them in bringing Cherwell up and doing some work for them and also doing some adaptive forms for them, or we've guided companies from the very beginning, from the ground up, where we've implemented Cherwell, but advised them on how to deal with adaptive forms to make the experience for their end users and their internal customers that much better. So in this case, we're going to start with a little bit of advice for administrators. As you can see on the screen, there's about 5 or 6 points here that I would really, actually I would say there's 5 here and there's one that I would say if you can do it, absolutely, go ahead and do it. But the big 5 on this slide are layout considerations. How you lay out that adaptive form and how you make it look and flow for the people that are using it is a really huge consideration, okay? You'll find that out is if you lay out an adaptive form for a variety of devices, how you think it should work, well, that's great. And sometimes they look great, but when you get into the actual working of the form and getting people that need to use that form on a day-to-day basis, and they start complaining and they're giving a lot of negative feedback, that's because it's not working for them. And that's just layout. The other piece in this is design process. When you're actually designing some of these adaptive forms, in this case, bring people in from the department, the group, or the team, or the organization, get them involved in the design process, because when you involve the stakeholders in the design process, that's when you get buy-in and you get adoption at a higher rate, okay? The other thing you have to consider too is browser considerations. How's that form going to work on an iPhone if they're using Safari or Chrome or Firefox or Edge? How's it going to work on a tablet? The other thing too with browser considerations is, does an organization support only one browser? As an example, we have a customer that will only support Google Chrome. You can have other browsers on your workstation or your laptop, but the problem is if you have an issue, they only support Chrome. So you got to consider the browsers that you're going to be designing for and how these forms are going to look in the different browsers. Now, the next one is challenges for the hybrid IT work models. As we all know, with coronavirus and pandemic, et cetera, a lot of work from home and a lot of work from home, which is a new concept for some people. Sometimes they're not always using the equipment that the office will provide, such as they may have a laptop, but they've got two 17-inch monitors at home, or they brought their monitors from work and they're using those, or they're using it on a Android tablet, or they're using it on an iPad or an iPad Pro, or they're working on an Android phone, which may be a Samsung Galaxy, etc. So you have to consider those challenges for the hybrid IT work model. And there's a couple other points, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Now, the next one, which is kind of the big one, is best practices for creation and design. And what I mean by this is, if you work for an organization and they have a style guide, and that defines, organizational colors, fonts, how certain things are to be positioned on the page, or on a form, or on a website, all of these things. If your organization has one, grab hold of it and find out what standards are, because that's going to be your best friend. Because if you design forms with specific fonts, font sizes, certain colors, those are the pieces of information that you need in order to stay compliant within the company guidelines. So style guides for designing adaptive forms is an absolute must if you have access to them. And if you don't, and if you have a marketing group, maybe this is the time to approach the marketing group and say, hey, how about we standardize on certain things? What should I be looking for? What should I do? Maybe they have some information for you also, okay? Plus also, if you're using the same standardized fonts and colors, etc., in your adaptive forms, that's something employees are used to looking for and working with. And it's just an extension of the business. Now, the point that I saved to last is emulators. There are emulators. I know once upon a time, you could design apps and have a BlackBerry emulator or an iPhone emulator. If you can find an emulator and you can get Cherwell working on an emulator, do it. Because if you can get it going and you can do it, absolutely, why wouldn't you? Because then you can at least see how your adaptive forms are going to look and feel on a particular size of device and type of device. And that gives you a heads up as to what's coming when you do put it out onto that device. Now on our next slide, we're going to talk about layout considerations. And I'm going to go through some of these later on when we get to an actual Cherwell layout for adaptive forms. Sometimes you have to be looking at your adaptive forms and you say, what are items that you are willing to sacrifice? All right, in this case, let's talk something real easy. In the desktop version of a Cherwell adaptive form, you may have a company logo, but that company logo is kind of a little wide and a little high. Well, on a mobile device, such as say an iPhone 12, do you really need the company logo? Could you just do with the company name at the top instead? And not only that, if you take out the company logo, it gives you a little bit more room for the fields that you need to display to the person using the forms. So you have to think of it that way. Are there some items that you are willing to sacrifice when you are doing your layouts, such as logos, maybe hints, maybe even information on how to fill out the form? Could you put it into a button with a one step that when you click it, it comes with a pop-up and tells you the information, and then they can close the pop-up afterwards. They've read whatever information is you have in there. That could be a very valuable tool. Could it also be in the case with layout considerations if you have a lot of text above fields? Instead of using the text of all the fields, why not use tooltips which are built into the fields? That's a great way. If somebody hovers over the field, that tooltip will pop up. The other thing you have to consider, and these two kind of go hand in hand when you look at layout considerations. What does the customer want? Customer being internal customer and maybe even sometimes external customer. But polling a group of external customers can be a little bit harder. In that case, then, what does your organization want? Okay, what is it that they actually want these forms to do? How do they want them to flow? How do they want them to work? How do internal customers want to deal with these forms? Again, this comes back to my previous point of bring the department, the group, the team, even members of the organization in on the design process and get them to bring their people in and give viable feedback to you when you're designing these forms. Because if you can do that, it again drives user adoption and also makes these people feel like their stake in ownership for the project is a lot higher than what it might normally be. That way, have a little bit of pride in what they end up rolling out. Now, the one and last thing is you have to consider how much scrolling do you want someone to do? In this case, how much scrolling would you want to do on a mobile phone versus a tablet? Or how much scrolling would you want to do on a laptop versus a desktop monitor? Obviously, the smaller you go, there is going to be some scrolling. You can never really get away from it. But then how do you deal with it? Do you minimize the scrolling left and right or up and down? In most cases with a mobile device like an Android phone or an iPhone, it would be left and right that you want to get rid of. Yes, they may have to scroll a little bit more up and down, but sometimes it's worth it in order to give them the fields they need to capture information in. And same thing with the laptop versus a tablet and a desktop monitor. You know, you have to decide what size the forms are going to be, and then you design for that size. So unfortunately, if your field techs always wanted small laptops and they've got an 11-inch laptop, but the form is really built for a 15, they're going to have to scroll. It's kind of the trade-off for what they wanted in the hardware. The other thing you're going to have to take into consideration when doing adaptive forms in Cherwell is your specifics forms. Okay. In the modern versions of Cherwell, 10.15, 10.14, 10.2, 10.22, etc., the layout's changed quite a bit in forms. And now the specifics form is more of a vertical form area and it's thinner. So in this case, for adaptive forms, you got to remember, consider your specifics forms because they have to fit into that small space on a mobile device or on a tablet. So if you have a wide specifics form, you may have to narrow it down a little bit in order for it to fit in properly into the adaptive form layout for the specifics form. Now, as we move on, we come to the design process. Some of the items here in the design process I've brought up already. And these come back to the organizational style guide. Again, things like colors and fonts, these are important. Also, when you're designing adaptive forms, a bold or an italicized font may look great on a desktop monitor, but it doesn't look too great on the screen of a Samsung Galaxy or of an iPhone. Also, you have to understand too, colors can play a lot in the design and the usability of a form. If you mix colors up, it sometimes can be hard to see, especially if you're on a device where you're out in bright sunlight. Some colors do not show up very well on a digital device. So you've got things like size of font, you've got whether it's bold, whether it's italicized, and colors. Those are your two major items that you have to consider right out of the box when you're dealing with adaptive forms. The other thing with adaptive forms in the design process is in a desktop screen, the way you've originally laid out the form may flow really, really well. How you tab from field to field, etc. But on a smaller screen, that same flow may not work. So you've got to design for logical flow on the smaller screen. Now, we've had this, and if anybody's been a Cherwell administrator for a while, we've probably all done this once or twice. I know I have, and I scratch my head when it doesn't work and I have to go back and I'm looking for the most bizarre reason, but really it's actually pretty straightforward and right in front of me, and that's off-screen issues. What I mean by this is when you're designing adaptive forms, sometimes we like to try and max out the space that a field takes, and we inch that field right to the very edge. Sometimes we go over the edge of the drawing area in the adaptive form. Then we preview then we save it and we look at the form and we wonder why some of the stuff is not showing up. That's because the actual field has left the drawing area in the adaptive form. Just simply go back and reduce your field on one side by a couple of points, and that'll take care of the issue. But it's also something that if you don't catch soon enough or early enough through testing of the adaptive forms before rollout, it can be a horrible experience because the user will look at the form and wonder where some of the fields are to collect some of the information. Also, the next point is mobile default. Some of the questions you have to ask yourself is, do you make your text smaller or do you leave it the same size as it currently is? Do you make your field box smaller or do you leave it the same size as it is? Do you leave the white space between fields or you reduce that? Again, these are all things to consider when designing adaptive forms and designing them for a mobile device, a tablet, a laptop, a monitor, etc. In regards to the specifics forms, as an example, I can give you is we had a customer who had over about 116 specifics forms for deployment. When we were telling them about how to use specifics forms in a mobile version, they were quite confused, thinking they would just work. Well, they didn't, because the specifics forms have to be created for the size of device. And also they were thinking they had to do all 116, when really it turned out they only needed 20 specifics forms really for a mobile version. Sometimes you have to consider too, how many different adaptive forms do you want? Okay, 3 version, that's pretty acceptable, but when you get into 6, 7, and 8, it can become very, very time consuming. At least one thing to look for is when designing adaptive forms, you can cut and paste fields between the different adaptive forms. So sometimes it makes design and the building process that much easier by being able to cut and paste, or copy and paste, I should say, not cut and paste, copy and paste forms between the different adaptive form layouts. Now, one thing that sometimes people don't consider is rollout plan. And a rollout plan can be very beneficial when you're trying to roll out adaptive forms. You don't want to try and boil the ocean, all right? I know we've all heard it before, but sometimes we get carried away. Whereas a rollout plan can be beneficial. If you've got 5 departments to deal with, maybe deal with your smallest department first. Roll them out. And that way, if they run into issues or they need certain tweaks or redesigns to happen, they can be dealt with easily. You don't want to push out 50 different adaptive forms when you should only be pushing out 5. And then gradually build from there. Utilize your experiences from each rollout to take to the next rollout so that you have that ability to know what happened and learn from the lessons of what's been done. And this way also, if you take your rollout plan and roll it out in smaller chunks, it's a little easier to manage. And if you have to do any kind of tweaks or redesigns, it can go pretty fast versus trying to deal with several all at once. The next thing to consider is the browser. In most cases now, we've all got a variety of browsers installed on our laptops or desktops or even our mobile devices. You know, whether you have all 4 here, whether it's, if you're using an Apple device, you would be using Safari, you could be using Firefox, Edge, and Chrome. You know, these 4 that I put here, they're kind of the big 4 right now, but you could have something else also, such as Opera or one of the any browser like Flow or anything like that. But you have to consider, you know, the browser when designing adaptive forms and how things work. As an example, I bring back the customer experience. Customer that supported only Chrome was going great. Then Chrome introduced a bunch of security updates. Some of those security updates took a few things out in their adaptive forms. That's just because of the way Chrome did its security. So in this case, when testing multiple browsers, it may seem a pain, but testing on the multiple browsers with your adaptive forms is actually a good practice, right? Because as we know, what displays right in Chrome and Edge and Firefox may not display right in Safari because Apple uses different fonts, and their fonts are a little bit off versus Edge versus Chrome, etc. The last thing you want when dealing with browsers is trial and error in overcoming these challenges of working with adaptive forms. You don't want to really wing it and say, yeah, it'll work. I know it will. No, just take the time, test, and make sure everything looks good and everything works right. And if there's any kind of pop-ups or anything that you have in the adaptive forms, make sure they all open. Because sometimes on smaller devices and mobile devices, pop-ups are blocked. So you got to make sure that blocking of pop-ups is not initiated. Again, for this fourth point, changes in security updates to browsers. Like I said, with Chrome, they were releasing quite a few security updates to their browser for quite a while. You have to test this stuff in order to make sure that these security updates are not going to be an issue for your adaptive form. Then you have to do also things such as, what is the difference between users? If you have a group of users that are administrators versus just plain users, will they see things differently versus the administrator? More than likely they will. But again, test, test, and test again. And if you're not sure, just test one more time to be on the safe side. The last point here on this slide is, what does your organization support? That's a case where, like I said, with the one customer, they only supported Chrome. That's what they wanted to do, and that's the way they went. Now, does your organization support only a certain browser or a couple of browsers, or do they let users install any browser and use any browser? That's one thing that needs to be considered. And when they do support multiple browsers or allow multiple browsers, how's that going to affect your adaptive forms and when you're working with them going forward? Again, let's talk about quickly the changes for the hybrid IT. As we all know, some of us are administrators, Cherwell admins, and we also wear other hats, such as maybe system administrators or network administrators. Some of the things we have to consider is, with a tablet, a laptop, a mobile device, monitor, importance. We have to know the devices your organization uses. So talking to the IT department, finding out about assets, that can be a valuable conversation to have. Because if the IT department has an 11-inch, a 13-inch, and a 15-inch laptop, that's great. Which one do you support? Which one do you design for? But then in passing, they say, oh yeah, we're doing a hardware refresh in 6 months, and we're standardizing all on 13-inch laptops. Well, guess what? That just made your decision a lot easier. You're designing adaptive forms for a 13-inch laptop monitor. Then you have to consider the mobile devices. Does the company only use iPhones? Which version? What age? Also, is it a case in point that they do Android? Again, which version, which age, etc. Monitors. Do they deploy 22-inch, 24-inch, 27-inch monitors? These are all things to consider. Now, the thing that can be tricky with the hybrid IT work and designing adaptive forms is when BYOD comes into consideration. Those bring your own devices, they can be pretty tricky for some IT departments. It's not that it's just the device itself, it's how they're configured. You don't know. And if you have 500 employees, you're not going to go to each employee and say, here, we're going to configure your iPad for you. As they take it home and then hand it over to their kids and let them play a game. You're going to have to decide or take a poll and say, do you have any kind of mobile devices? What are they? What size, etc. That's where it leads to the next point. Deciding which size of device you're going to support with your adaptive forms. So again, if we go back to our monitor analogy, we've got older 22 inches, we've got 24-inch, and we got 27-inch monitors. Do we take the middle ground here and design for a 24-inch monitor? Yep, I would. But then if you find out IT is going to do a hardware refresh and give everybody 27-inch monitors. Well, it's pretty standard, you know. I mean, I would say you keep designing for a 24 or 27-inch monitor. That's a choice you can make, right? But it's knowing which size of devices you have and which ones you're going to support. It's like the 11, 13, and the 15-inch monitor size. And then you find out 13-inch monitors are going to become standard. Well, design for the 13. So the hybrid IT market, or the hybrid IT work model, I should say, makes this difficult because people are accessing information in an omni-channel approach. In this case, constantly moving and switching devices to access the info, such as a sales rep person may be accessing an iPad Pro 12-inch at home, but if they actually have to physically go out to customers or do runs, etc., they're using maybe an iPhone Plus or a smaller iPhone or something else. So they're constantly going to go between that device or devices. And when they do, they want to see an experience that is enjoyable and equivalent each and every time on all their different devices. So these are things to take into consideration too. This one, I'm not going to take a whole lot of time on because emulators are a little weird. And as I say, and I'm going to date myself here, you know, once upon a time, you could download a BlackBerry emulator or even an iPhone emulator. And maybe if you were a developer, you had access to ones. And then if you could link Cherwell up to it, guess what? Then you can run the emulator and you can see potentially what your Cherwell adaptive form will look like on that device. So if you can find one that you like and you can work with, download it and away you go. And that way you can run the adaptive form to have an idea to see how it looks and feels and what it's going to do on that mobile or tablet. And that way you have a better idea as to what the end user experience is going to be. Plus, if you can get an emulator, if you have Macs in your Cherwell environment and Windows machines, you want to be able to get an emulator if you're going to go that route that can work for the Mac OS, right? The other thing too is you're going to want to try it in portrait and landscape mode. How do these things shift? Because sometimes they may not shift as easily as you think until you actually test it. But again, this is something that I was just going to touch on briefly. And emulators, if you can do it and you can get one and you can share your adaptive forms in it, please go ahead. Might be an easy way to deal with the problem of testing your adaptive forms for multiple devices. Some of the benefits of the adaptive form is you know exactly what make and model of device you're going to support. So you know that form is going to show up the way you want each and every time. The other aspect of the adaptive form is you're going to have to try and find ways to find a happy medium. Again, if the example of the 11, 13, and 15-inch laptop monitor, designing for the 13, that might be your happy medium. And then the third point is much like, as I said earlier, only support certain sizes and scrolling will apply to others. So in this case, you're going to have to rethink how much scrolling you want to do on a smaller device and whether it's vertical or horizontal. Because if it's a combination sometimes on mobile devices of vertical and horizontal scrolling, it makes a very poor experience for that end user. Fourth point, there are multitudes of different forms that can be created. In this case, be strategic on where to adopt. Do you actually need every form in Cherwell in an adaptive form? If you don't, or does every form you have need multiple adaptive forms, I should say? That's what you're going to have to decide as a Cherwell administrator, and also with feedback from the business. Because if you don't need multiple versions of an adaptive form, you go with exactly what works best for certain devices and also for certain platforms of hardware. Now, the next part of this, this demonstration is actually the demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a version of Cherwell. And this is a Cherwell 10.2 installation with the new adaptive layout. So as you can see here, we have the first layout, which is our base layout, and it's for a desktop monitor. Okay, you have your adaptive form broken up into 3 areas. In this case, on this side here, you have your actual fields that you are using, right? And as you can, the middle piece is the area where your specifics form will show up. The additional questions and the border around it, this is just a placeholder, and the interior of the form of the placeholder is where your specifics form will show up. So already, as you can see here, you're designing a specific form for a small area. Now, depending on what you have in your form, you may have some actions over here on the right. And these are usually one-steps that allow a user to do something on that particular form, such as escalate to a level 2, create a problem out of this incident, or create a change request. So you have to consider a variety of things on this actual adaptive form. And like I say, this first one that we're looking at, it was designed in mind for an actual desktop monitor. Now, the next version of the adaptive form that we're going to look at, this one was designed for a tablet. As you can see, there's going to be some scrolling here, okay? And in this case, it's vertical scrolling. Now, what could you do to reduce that? In this case, you see there's a certain amount of white space between the customer label and the actual field. This could be a case in point where coming here, disconnecting the field from the label, grabbing your items, and just simply doing something as easy as shifting the field up tighter underneath the label. That's already given you a bit more room. So doing something as simple as that, and going like this, and then just bringing this item up underneath the form, sorry, I didn't disconnect this. Bringing these items up underneath the actual field label a little tighter can actually do a lot for you in the end. Now in this case, now that I've done that, I'm going to just bring this field up too. Oop, a little too far. And this is the thing you have to consider. What's the spacing you want when you're dealing with an adaptive form? So in the case of doing that, by removing some of the white space, it's going to give you a little bit more space on this adaptive form. That way, in this case, maybe your actions can come up a little higher on the form, so you're not scrolling as much vertically. The other thing you could potentially do too here is, with the actions, you could also go with the concept of, do I move them around? Do I put them side by side in order to make them a little tighter and in order to gain a little bit more room? It could be something that could be done and may actually get you a bit more room that you want on the actual adaptive form and going that way. So those are a couple things to consider in this particular case for a tablet form version of the adaptive form. The last form we have here is the mobile form version. As you can see, again, there's a lot of white space here. Taking out that white space and compacting that white space can be very beneficial. The other aspect is we see that we have a lot of scrolling here. Again, doing simple things such as grouping the actions side by side, that can help a lot, reduce the amount of scrolling vertically. Also, the other thing you can do is, in this case, we've got the theme font control. Let's say if you have the standardized font in the organization of Calibri, maybe instead of doing it the standardized theme font, changing the font to your standard font and maybe reducing it in size down to 10. In this case, I may even take it and make it bold. That would still stand out. But even taking it to Calibri size 10 for the font, that could save you quite a bit of room. But now bolding it, in this case, it does show and does stand out a little better versus if it was not bolded. In this case, by leaving it unbolded, it would be a little bit hard to see on a mobile device. Whereas by just clicking that button, that can add a lot to the value of this particular adaptive form. Even the same with other form labels, such as this one. It's again form control. So, excuse me, if we take it down to a size 10, make it bold, that's still pretty easy to see and read, especially on a mobile device. And then if you manage to bring the field, even if you brought the field a little bit smaller in height, right? That'll still give you room, a bit more room. And if you take all of these fields and reduce them in size a little bit, it will give you a lot more room on this mobile version of the adaptive form. So in some cases, just playing around and thinking a little bit and taking a bit of time, you can actually end up with an adaptive form that is actually very good, very, very robust, and also very usable for the end users. Now, in some cases with responsive forms, sometimes with responsive forms, depending on what you want to do with them, you may have to know a little bit of coding in order to get the form to work the way you want. Whereas with an adaptive form, in this case, when you build it, you know exactly what you're getting and you know exactly how it's going to, the look and feel of it is going to work going forward. Again, if you wanted to, you could actually do some other size forms in here. Let's say you wanted to have a larger monitor. Say you were rolling out some larger monitors. You could do one in here for engineering monitor. You could specify your width, your height. Your width could be, say, 2500. You could give a maximum width of 2500. Okay, but your height is 2390. You can even change the color of the adaptive form at the top here so you know exactly which one's which. So let's say we're going to go with a dark orange for the engineering guys. If you also wanted, give it a description. Why don't we just do that? And there you go. Now you see what happens is you have your adaptive form layout for the engineering monitors. Here you can do whatever you want. In the case what I was saying earlier, what we can do here is if I wanted to, I could just highlight all this text and I could come up here, just go edit, copy, come over to the new form layout that I have and just go edit and paste. Then what will happen is Cherwell will paste it into the locations that it was originally on the previous form that you took it from. In this case, if I was going to do a bigger specifics form for the engineers, I could actually just take all of these and move them way over here so that I can give them the bigger specifics form. And this is what I was saying about being able to quickly copy and paste between the different types of adaptive form layouts that you have to build your new versions of an adaptive form. Makes it very easy, makes it very quick, and you know what you're getting. So again, we could position this here, and we could just stretch it right out to give them a bigger particular form. Because if you know your engineering guys are never going to use this adaptive form on a mobile device, this is perfect. You can give them what they want right away and quite easily. So as we come back to the base layout, we know we have our questions here. Sorry, let's go back to this one for a minute. We know we have these fields here. If you, like I say, if you want, you could make these bigger, you can make them longer, more white space. In this case, you could even take certain things off of this form and then combine side by side versus a vertical aspect. So as you can see, it's very easy to build an adaptive form, and it's very easy to create multiple versions of an adaptive form. And that is pretty much it for all we have for the demo this afternoon. Now, if we go back for a second, we're just going to come to our next slide, and we have some time to talk about questions. And before we do answer some questions, I'm just going to turn it over to Tabitha again to talk a little bit about Quest for Collaboration.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. So if any of you have questions, you can go ahead and leave them in the questions window now. But I wanted to thank Sean again for presenting today. And in the meantime, invite all of you to our Quest for Collaboration. This is a weekly meeting that we saw a need for in 2020. And if you've attended a Cherwell user group before, it is very similar, as in there is no sales information included. We just bring together our Cherwell customers, friends, acquaintances for an hour once a week to discuss your problems, challenges, and other Cherwell related questions as a group. And then we work together to share knowledge and solve issues. So you can sign up and join us when you can on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern. If you just head over to our website, excaliburdata.com, and then if you go under the resources tab, upcoming events, you'll see it laid out right there alongside any other webinars that we have set up currently. So with that, I don't see any questions in the box, so I'm going to take that as that was an awesome presentation, Sean. And I think that they got the knowledge that they needed. So I will send this recording out tomorrow, and then you can go ahead and share it with your teams. But for now, thanks for attending, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you everybody for taking the time this afternoon to join us, and hopefully this was helpful.
Thank you.